The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of Margaret Chen's two-story colonial home in suburban Denver, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors she'd polished to perfection just days before. The house that had once buzzed with Christmas morning excitement now sat in profound silence, broken only by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of children playing in the snow outside. Margaret stood in her kitchen, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, staring at the dining room table that could seat 12 but would host only one today. 23 years of Christmas mornings flashed through her mind like a movie. Real David's squeals of delight as a toddler, discovering Santa's gifts. Teenage David, rolling his eyes but secretly thrilled about the elaborate treasure hunts she'd create. And just last year, adult David with his new wife Sarah, both laughing as they opened presents, while Christmas music played softly in the background. The phone call had come 2 weeks ago, David's voice carrying that particular tone he used when he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Mom, Sarah's parents really want us to come to Phoenix this year. Her grandmother isn't doing well, and this might be her last Christmas with the family, you understand, right?" Of course she understood. Margaret had always been the understanding mother, the one who put everyone else's needs first, who smiled and said, "Of course, honey," even when her heart was quietly breaking. She'd raised David to be considerate, to think of others, to be the kind of man who would prioritize his wife's family during difficult times. She should be proud that her lessons had taken root so deeply. "Absolutely," she had replied, her voice steady and warm. "Sarah's grandmother needs you more than I do right now. Send her my love." But understanding and accepting were two different creatures entirely. Now, as Christmas morning stretched endlessly before her, Margaret felt the weight of 23 years of tradition settling on her shoulders like a heavy winter coat she couldn't take off. She walked through the house, each room telling the story of Christmases past. In the living room, the 8-foot Fraser fir stood magnificently decorated, its lights twinkling against ornaments collected over decades. There was the clay handprint David had made in kindergarten, now faded but still hanging in the place of honor, the wooden reindeer he'd carved in high school shop class, the baby's first Christmas ornament from 2001, when David was born and became her entire world. Margaret had considered not putting up a tree this year. What was the point of decorating for an audience of one? But some deep part of her couldn't bear the thought of a Christmas without the ritual, without the familiar scent of pine needles and the warm glow of lights against the December darkness, so she'd decorated anyway, telling herself it was for her own joy. Pretending her hands weren't shaking as she hung each memory-laden ornament. The presents she'd wrapped for David and Sarah sat beneath the tree, looking lonely and somehow accusatory. She'd ship them tomorrow, she decided. Priority mail with tracking, because even in her hurt, she couldn't bear the thought of their gifts arriving late or lost. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop. A text from David. "Merry Christmas. Mom, Phoenix is beautiful. Sarah's grandmother is so happy we're here. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Love you." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She could reply with the truth that she was spending Christmas alone for the first time in her adult life, that the silence was so profound it made her ears ring, that she'd made enough food to feed a small army out of habit and now had no idea what to do with it all. She could tell him about the way she'd woken up at 6 a.m. out of instinct, expecting to hear his footsteps on the stairs, expecting the chaos and joy that had defined every Christmas morning since he was born. Instead, she typed, "So glad you're all together, enjoy every moment. Love you too." She set the phone down and looked around her kitchen, taking inventory of her preparations. 3 pies cooling on the counter, apple pumpkin, and David's favorite pecan. A 20-pound turkey? That would feed her for weeks. Homemade stuffing that filled the house with the scent of sage and onions. Mashed potatoes made from scratch. Green bean casserole and her mother's famous dinner rolls that took 3 days to prepare properly. All of it made with the muscle memory of a woman who had spent over 2 decades perfecting the art of the Christmas feast, who had learned her son's preferences so thoroughly that she could cook his ideal meal blindfolded. All of it sitting in a kitchen that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too full of echoes from happier times. Margaret had always prided herself on being a strong woman. She'd raised David as a single mother after his father walked out when David was 3, worked 2 jobs to keep them in their home, attended every soccer game and school play despite exhaustion that went bone deep. She'd weathered every storm life had thrown at them with grace and determination, always putting on a brave face for her son, always making sure he felt secure and loved despite the chaos of their early years together. But this felt different. This wasn't a crisis to manage or a challenge to overcome. This was just ... absence. The absence of tradition, of family, of the rituals that had given shape and meaning to her year for over 2 decades. It was the kind of loss that couldn't be fixed with determination or positive thinking, only endured. With whatever dignity she could muster, she thought about calling her sister Linda in Seattle. But Linda had her own family chaos to manage, twin teenagers who were probably driving her crazy, a husband who was wonderful but helpless in the kitchen, and in-laws who were visiting and needed constant entertainment. The last thing Linda needed was her older sister's melancholy adding to the mix. Her neighbor, Carol, had invited her to their Christmas gathering, a kind gesture that Margaret had politely declined. The thought of being the object of pity, the poor empty nester, tagging along to someone else's family celebration, made her skin crawl. She'd rather spend the day alone than endure well-meaning sympathy and the inevitable. Awkward conversations about David's absence. Outside, snow began to fall in fat. Lazy flakes that clung to the windows before melting into tiny rivulets. Margaret watched the neighborhood come alive with Christmas morning energy, children running between houses to show off new bikes and toys, parents carrying casserole dishes to family gatherings. The warm glow of lights in every window except, it seemed, her own. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years making sure David felt loved and secure, creating traditions so strong and meaningful that he'd carry them into his own family someday. But somehow, in all her careful parenting, she'd forgotten to prepare for this moment when those traditions would migrate to a new generation, a new family, leaving her behind like a tree that had given all its fruit and now stood bare against the winter sky. Margaret finished her coffee and made a decision. She couldn't spend the entire day wallowing in self-pity, drowning in the silence of her too-empty house. She needed to do something to find some way to make this day meaningful, even if it looked nothing like the Christmases she'd imagined. She thought about the news stories she'd been hearing lately, about families struggling with inflation, about veterans living on the streets, about elderly people spending holidays alone in nursing homes. Maybe her abundance of food didn't have to go to waste. Maybe there was a way to honor the spirit of Christmas, even if the traditions had been upended. 20 minutes later, Margaret was on her laptop searching for local shelters and community centers that might be serving Christmas meals. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, purpose beginning to replace the aimless sorrow that had paralyzed her all morning. Downtown Denver had several options. The rescue mission was serving dinner from noon to 4 p.m. and still needed volunteers. The community kitchen was looking for help with food prep and service. The Veteran Center was hosting a special Christmas lunch for homeless veterans and their families. Margaret stared at the volunteer sign-up forms on her screen, her heart beginning to beat faster. She could do this. She could take all this food. She'd prepared all this love she had ready to give and find people who needed it. The recipients might be different than she'd planned, but the spirit of generosity and care that had always defined her Christmases didn't have to die just because. Her son was in Phoenix. She clicked on the rescue mission's website and found their phone number. Her hands were trembling slightly as she dialed, but her voice was steady when a cheerful volunteer answered. Denver Rescue Mission. This is Patricia. Merry Christmas. Hi Patricia, this is Margaret Chen. I'm calling about volunteering today. I know it's last minute, but I have a lot of food prepared and I'd love to help serve if you need someone. Oh honey, we can always use extra hands. What kind of food are we talking about? Margaret looked around her kitchen at the feast she'd prepared. Well, I have a full turkey, homemade stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, dinner rolls, and 3 pies. It's enough to feed probably 20 people, maybe more. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Patricia's voice came back warmer than before. Margaret, that's incredibly generous. We absolutely need that food and we need you. Can you be here by 11:30? We start serving at noon, but we'll need time to get everything set up. I'll be there, Margaret said, and for the first time all morning she felt something other than sadness. She felt useful, she felt needed. She felt like the person she'd always been, someone who took care of others, someone who created warmth and nourishment wherever she went. As she began packing her food into containers and gathering serving utensils, Margaret felt a shift in the day's energy. The silence of her house no longer felt oppressive but peaceful, like the calm before something important was about to happen. She wasn't sure what she'd find at the shelter, but she knew that whatever it would be better than sitting alone with her memories and her regrets. She thought about texting David to tell him about her plans, then decided against it. This wasn't about making him feel guilty or proving a point. This was about finding a way to honor Christmas that felt true to who she was, regardless of who was or wasn't sitting at her dining room table. Margaret loaded her car with enough food to feed a small army, her movements quick and efficient with purpose. The morning that had started in such profound loneliness was transforming into something else, entirely an adventure. A chance to discover what Christmas could look like when stripped of expectations and rebuilt from the ground up as she backed out of her driveway, leaving behind the perfect house with its perfect decorations and perfect silence. Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel on this Christmas morning: excitement. She was about to spend Christmas with complete strangers, in a place she'd never been, doing something she'd never done before, and for the first time in weeks, that felt exactly right. The Denver Rescue Mission sat on a busy street downtown, its brick facade worn but welcoming, with large windows that glowed warmly against the gray December sky. Margaret pulled into the small parking lot behind the building, her Honda Accord loaded with enough Christmas dinner to feed a crowd. As she sat for a moment collecting herself, she watched volunteers hurrying in and out of the back entrance, their arms full of supplies and their faces bright with purpose. This was really happening. She was really doing this. Patricia turned out to be a woman in her 60s with silver hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of smile that made you feel like you'd been friends for years. She met Margaret at the back door, taking in the sight of the loaded car with visible relief. "Oh, Margaret, bless your heart. You have no idea how perfect your timing is. We had 2 volunteer groups canceled this morning. Family emergencies, and we were worried we wouldn't have enough food. This is going to make all the difference." As they unloaded Margaret's contributions, Patricia kept up a steady stream of chatter that helped calm Margaret's nerves. "We serve about 150 people on Christmas Day, sometimes more. It's not just homeless folks, you know. We get elderly people who have nowhere else to go, families who are struggling, veterans, young people who've aged out of foster care, all kinds of people who just need a warm meal and some human kindness." The kitchen was bustling with activity volunteers chopping vegetables, stirring enormous pots of soup, arranging desserts on trays. The air was thick with the sense of home cooking and filled with the kind of cheerful chaos that Margaret remembered from her own kitchen during holidays past. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt energized. This was familiar territory, just on a much larger scale. "Margaret, meet Rosa," Patricia said, introducing her to a compact Latina woman who was orchestrating the kitchen operations with the precision of a general commanding troops. "Rosa's been running our Christmas kitchen. For 8 years she put you to work." Rosa looked at Margaret with assessing eyes that quickly softened. "First time? Is it that obvious?" Margaret asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Honey, you look like you're about to face a firing squad. Relax. These people are just hungry, same as anyone else. They're grateful for whatever we can give them, and most of them are nicer than half the people you'd meet at a fancy restaurant." Rosa's hands never stopped moving as she talked, seasoning and stirring with practiced ease. "Your turkey smells amazing, by the way. How'd you cook it?" As Margaret described her preparation method, she found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of kitchen talk. Rosa listened with the attention of someone who took food seriously, nodding approvingly at Margaret's technique and asking detailed questions about her stuffing recipe. "You ever think about cooking professionally?" Rosa asked as they worked together to carve the turkey into serving portions. "Not really. I just learned because I wanted my son to have good food growing up. His father wasn't around much, so I tried to make up for it in other ways." Rosa nodded knowingly. Kids remember that stuff. Even when they don't say it, they remember. "Your boy's lucky." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of David, but pushed it aside. Today wasn't about her complicated feelings about being alone. Today was about feeding people who needed feeding. By 11:45, the serving line was set up and volunteers were taking their positions. Margaret found herself stationed behind the mashed potatoes, ladle in hand, wearing a volunteer apron that read "Spread love like butter." Patricia had positioned her between Rosa and a cheerful college student named Jake, who was home from Colorado State for winter break. "My mom basically forced me to volunteer," Jake confided as they waited for the doors to open. "Said I needed to do something meaningful with my break, instead of just playing video games. But honestly, I'm kind of excited. I've never done anything like this before." "Neither have I," Margaret admitted, and Jake's face lit up with relief. "Really? You seem so calm and professional. I thought you'd been doing this for years." Before Margaret could respond, the doors opened and the first guests began filtering in. Margaret's nervous energy transformed into focused attention as she watched the faces and linemen and women of all ages, some clearly homeless, others who might have been anyone's neighbor, children holding their parents' hands, elderly folks moving slowly but determinedly toward the promise of a warm meal. The first person to reach Margaret's station was an elderly African-American man with kind eyes and a military bearing despite his worn clothes. "Happy Christmas, ma'am," he said politely, holding out his plate. "Merry Christmas to you too," Margaret replied, ladling a generous portion of potatoes onto his plate. "Would you like extra gravy?" "That's very kind. Thank you. His voice carried the accent of the rural South, and Margaret found herself wondering about his story, about the path that had brought him to this line on Christmas Day. As the line continued, Margaret fell into the rhythm of service. Each person brought a moment of connection, a thank you, a smile, sometimes a brief conversation. A young mother with 2 small children who looked exhausted but grateful. A man about David's age who couldn't meet her eyes but whispered, "Thank you," so quietly, she almost missed it. An elderly woman who complimented her wedding ring and told her she looked like her daughter who lived in California. What struck Margaret most was how normal it all felt. These weren't characters from a news story or statistics from a report. They were just people dealing with circumstances that could happen to anyone, looking for the same thing she was, looking for connection, kindness, a sense that they mattered to someone. "You're a natural at this," Rosa observed during a brief lull in the line. "Look how you talk to everyone, make them feel seen. That's not something you can teach." Margaret was about to downplay the compliment when she noticed a commotion near the entrance. A family had just walked in, a father carrying a toddler, a mother with a baby in her arms, and 2 children who looked to be maybe 8 and 10 years old. The parents looked young, early 30s at most, and their clothes were clean but worn. The father was scanning the room with the expression of someone who had never been in a situation like this before, and wasn't sure of the protocol without thinking. Margaret stepped out from behind the serving line and approached them. "Welcome," she said warmly. "Are you here for Christmas dinner?" The father looked relieved at her friendly approach. "Yes, ma'am. This is our first time. We're not really sure how this works. It's very simple," Margaret assured him. "You just get in line and we'll make sure everyone gets plenty to eat. There are tables over there where you can sit as a family." She smiled at the children, who were staring wide-eyed at the bustling activity around them. "Are you guys excited about Christmas?" The older boy nodded shyly. "We opened presents this morning, but Mom said we had to come here for dinner because our stove isn't working." The mother's face flushed slightly, and Margaret's heart clenched with recognition. She remembered that feeling from David's early childhood, the shame of not being able to provide what felt like basic necessities. The fear that people would judge you for circumstances beyond your control. "Well, you're in for a treat," Margaret said quickly, keeping her voice light and cheerful. "We have turkey and all the trimmings, plus 3 different kinds of pie for dessert. And I happen to know that the mashed potatoes are particularly good today because I made them myself." The little girl giggled at that, and the tension in her mother's shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Margaret walked them to the back of the line, chatting with the children about their Christmas presents and making sure they knew where to find high chairs for the toddler and baby. As she returned to her station, Margaret caught Rosa watching her with an approving expression. Like I said, natural. The afternoon continued in waves of activity punctuated by brief respites. Margaret found herself energized rather than exhausted by the constant interaction. Each person she served became a small story, a moment of human connection that felt more genuine than most of the social interactions she'd had in months. There was Harold, a veteran who told her about spending Christmas in Vietnam in 1969 and how this dinner reminded him of the best parts of military camaraderie. Maria, who spoke limited English, but whose smile needed no translation as she thanked Margaret in both Spanish and carefully pronounced English. Tommy, a teenager who was clearly trying to act tough, but whose face lit up when he saw pecan pie? "My grandma used to make pecan pie," he said, his careful facade dropping for a moment. "She passed last year. Haven't had it since? Would you like an extra big piece?" Margaret asked, and his nod was almost shy. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to notice something unexpected happening to her own emotional state. The grief and loneliness that had sat so heavily on her chest that morning hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else. She felt useful in a way she hadn't in months, needed in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or guilt, and everything to do with simple human kindness. Around 3 p.m., during another brief lull, Jake leaned over from his station, managing the dinner rolls. "This is way cooler than I expected. These people all have such interesting stories. That guy over there, he used to be a chef at some fancy restaurant in New York. And that woman with the red scarf, she's working on her PhD but had to choose between paying for food or paying for textbooks this month." Margaret nodded, understanding what he meant. Before today, she'd thought about homelessness and food insecurity in abstract terms, problems that happen to other people, statistics she read about in the newspaper. But spending the afternoon serving meals had humanized these issues in a way that felt profound and permanent. The young family she'd greeted earlier was sitting at a table near the serving line, and Margaret found herself glancing over at them throughout the afternoon. The parents were talking quietly while the children ate with the focused intensity of kids who were genuinely hungry. The sight of them reminded her of countless family dinners with David when he was young, the way children could find joy and comfort in the simple act of a shared meal. As closing time approached, the volunteers began the process of cleaning up and packing away leftover food. Margaret worked alongside people she'd met just hours ago but who now felt like old friends, united by the shared experience of service and the particular satisfaction that comes from feeding people well. Patricia approached her as she was wiping down serving surfaces. "I can't thank you enough for today, not just for the food though, that turkey was absolutely incredible, but for the way you connected with everyone. You made people feel valued, and that's worth more than any amount of food." "I think I got more out of it than I gave," Margaret replied, and realized she meant it completely. "This was exactly what I needed today, even though I didn't know it. When I woke up this morning," Patricia studied her face with the perceptive eye of someone who'd worked with volunteers for years. "You know, we could use someone like you on a regular basis. Not necessarily every day, but maybe once a week. We serve dinner every Tuesday night, and we're always looking for volunteers who understand that this work is about dignity as much as it's about food." Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement. I'd like that very much." As she loaded her empty containers back into her car, Margaret's phone buzzed with another text from David. This time it was a photo David and Sarah with her extended family around a large dining table, everyone wearing ugly Christmas sweaters and grinning at the camera. The message read, "Sarah's cousin made the funniest toast about family traditions. Wish you could have heard it. Hope your day was peaceful." Margaret stared at the photo for a long moment, taking in David's happy face, the obvious warmth and joy of the gathering. A few hours ago, this image would have brought tears to her eyes, would have highlighted everything she was missing, everyone who had chosen someone else's family over hers. Now, looking at it in the parking lot of the Denver rescue mission, with the sounds of satisfied guests and hardworking volunteers still echoing in her ears, Margaret felt something different. She felt genuinely happy for David, genuinely glad that he was surrounded by love and laughter. And more surprising still, she felt proud of herself for finding her own way to honor Christmas, for discovering that family and tradition could be broader and more flexible than she'd ever imagined. She typed back, "It looks wonderful, honey. I'm so glad you're all together. I had quite an adventure today, myself, ended up volunteering at a shelter downtown. Met some incredible people. Love you." As she drove home through the snowy Denver streets, Margaret felt fundamentally changed. By the day, the empty house waiting for her no longer felt like a symbol of abandonment, but like a peaceful retreat after meaningful work. The leftover food in her refrigerator wouldn't go to waste. She was already planning to pack it up and bring it to the shelter tomorrow. Most importantly, she'd discovered something about herself that she'd never known, that her capacity for nurturing and care wasn't limited to her biological family, that the love she'd poured into raising David could flow in many directions, nourishing people she'd never met but who needed it just as much as her son ever had. Christmas morning had started with the devastating silence of unwanted solitude. It was ending with the warm buzz of community, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from discovering that you're needed in ways you never expected. Margaret pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment, looking at her house with its perfect decorations and empty rooms. Tomorrow, she'd probably feel the absence of traditional family Christmas more acutely. But tonight, she felt like she'd found something equally valuable, a new way to be herself in the world. A new understanding of what it meant to create family, and meaning beyond the boundaries of blood and obligation. Inside, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in her living room, surrounded by the gentle glow of Christmas lights and the lingering scent of pine. Her phone was quiet, her house was quiet, but she didn't feel alone. She felt connected to something larger than herself, part of a community of people who showed up for each other when it mattered most. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like exactly enough. Margaret woke up the day after Christmas with an energy she hadn't felt in months. Instead of the post-holiday blues she'd been dreading, she found herself eager to get out of bed. Her mind already turning to the leftover food in her refrigerator and the promise she'd made to Patricia about returning to the shelter. She'd slept better than she had in weeks. Her dreams filled not with empty tables and silence, but with the faces of the people she'd served. Harold's military bearing, Maria's grateful smile, the young family learning to navigate circumstances they'd never imagined they'd face. Each memory brought with it a sense of purpose that felt both new and deeply familiar. Like rediscovering a part of herself she'd forgotten existed. Her phone showed 3 messages from David, sent throughout the previous evening. The first was a response to her text about volunteering. "Mom, that's amazing. I had no idea you were interested in volunteer work. Tell me more about it." The second, sent a few hours later, "Sarah and I were just talking about how proud we are of you for spending Christmas helping others. That's so typical of you to find a way to make the day meaningful." The third, sent late at night Denver time. Can't stop thinking about what you did yesterday. I keep imagining you in that kitchen taking care of people the way you always took care of me. I love you so much, Mom. Reading David's messages, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. The maternal part of her heart swelled with pride that she'd raised a son who could recognize and appreciate acts of service. But there was also a small, sharp awareness that David's admiration for her volunteer work seemed to carry with it a lack of recognition for how alone she'd been, how much the decision to spend Christmas at the shelter had been born from necessity rather than pure altruism. She pushed that thought aside as unworthy. David's response was loving and supportive, exactly what any mother would want to hear from her son. If he didn't fully understand the circumstances that had led her to the rescue mission, that was probably for the best. The last thing she wanted was for him to carry guilt about his perfectly reasonable decision to spend Christmas with his wife's family. Margaret made coffee and toast, then began the process of packing up the remaining food from Christmas dinner. There were still generous portions of turkey, stuffing, and sides enough to feed several families. As she worked, she found herself planning not just this trip to the shelter but future meals she could prepare, future ways she could be useful. The drive downtown felt different in daylight, more intentional. Yesterday she'd been fleeing loneliness. Today she was moving toward purpose. The difference in mindset was subtle but profound, and Margaret could feel it in the way she held her shoulders, the way she breathed more deeply as she navigated the familiar streets. At the shelter, Patricia greeted her with surprised delight. "Margaret, I hoped we'd see you again, but I didn't expect you back so soon. I brought the leftovers from yesterday, and I was hoping I could help with whatever you're doing today," Margaret explained, hefting containers from her car. "I know you said Tuesdays are when you really need volunteers, but if there's anything I can do, there's always something," Patricia assured her. "We're actually doing a different kind of service. Today's less formal than yesterday's dinner, more like a drop-in meal for people who need something warm, and we're organizing donations that came in over the holiday. Could use someone with your organizational skills to help sort through everything." The next few hours passed in productive activity. Margaret found herself working alongside volunteers she'd met the day before, but also new people who'd been drawn to service in the aftermath of Christmas. There was something magical about the post-holiday volunteer surge. Patricia explained people who'd spent Christmas morning counting their blessings and decided to act on their gratitude. "It's one of my favorite times of year here," Patricia said as they sorted through donated clothing. "Christmas Day brings out the people who are already committed to service, but December 26th brings out the people who've just discovered they want to be." Margaret understood exactly what she meant. Yesterday she'd been running from something. Today she was running toward something. The shift felt significant, like the difference between charity born from guilt and service born from genuine calling. Around noon, she was helping in the kitchen when she heard a familiar laugh. Turning, she spotted Harold, the veteran she'd served potatoes to the day before. He was sitting at one of the tables, engaged in animated conversation with two other men around. "His age?" "Harold," Margaret called out, and his weathered face broke into a grin when he saw her. "Well, if it isn't the potato lady, you came back." "I did. How are you doing today? Can't complain?" 3 square meals in 2 days, that's better than I manage most weeks." His tone was matter-of-fact rather than self-pitying. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about this being your first time volunteering here." Margaret nodded, curious about where this was heading. "Most first-timers, they come in nervous, you know? Like they're doing charity work for poor, unfortunate souls who need their pity. But you talked to everyone, like we were people you actually wanted to meet." Made a difference, that did. The compliment caught Margaret off guard, and she felt her cheeks warm. "I think I was more nervous than I let on, but everyone was so kind to me. I felt welcomed." "That's because you welcomed us first," Harold said simply. "Respect goes both ways, always has." As Margaret continued her work that day, Harold's words stayed with her. She'd approached the shelter not with a savior complex or a sense of charitable duty, but with genuine need for purpose, for connection, for a way to channel the nurturing energy that was such a fundamental part of who she was. Maybe that authenticity had translated into the way she'd interacted with the guests, creating space for real human connection rather than the sometimes awkward dynamic between helper and helped. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret was in the kitchen helping prepare sandwiches for the evening meal when Patricia appeared with a young woman in tow. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Jessica Chen, no relation, I assume, despite the name." Jessica is a reporter with the Denver Post, and she's doing a story about holiday volunteering. She was hoping to interview some of our volunteers about their experiences. Jessica was probably in her late 20s, with an eager energy that reminded Margaret of David when he was passionate about something. Ms. Chen, Patricia told me you were here both yesterday and today, and that you made a real impact on the people you served. Would you be willing to talk to me about what brought you to volunteer? Margaret's first instinct was to decline. The last thing she wanted was to be featured in a newspaper story as the sad, empty nester who'd had nowhere to go on Christmas. But something in Jessica's genuine curiosity made her reconsider. I suppose I could answer a few questions, Margaret said carefully. They sat at one of the quieter tables, and Jessica pulled out a small recorder. What I'm really interested in, she began, is the human story behind holiday volunteering. What brings people to give up their Christmas to serve others? Margaret considered the question carefully. I'm not sure I gave up anything, actually. I think I gained more than I gave. Christmas looked different for me this year than it has in the past, and volunteering here helped me discover new ways to celebrate the holiday that felt meaningful and authentic. Can you tell me more about that? What made Christmas look different this year? Margaret found herself sharing more than she'd intended, not the painful details of David's absence, but the broader story of how life transitions can create opportunities to reevaluate traditions and find new sources of meaning. She talked about the surprise of discovering how much she enjoyed the work, how natural it had felt to connect with the shelter's guests, how the experience had opened her eyes to the needs in her own community. What struck me most, Margaret said, was how normal everything felt. These weren't charity cases or statistics, they were just people dealing with challenging circumstances, looking for the same things we all want: good food, human connection, a sense that someone cares about their well-being. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. Do you plan to continue volunteering here? Absolutely. I've already committed to helping with their Tuesday dinner service, and I'm hoping to find other ways to be useful as well. This experience has shown me that I have skills and energy I wasn't using, and there's clearly a need for them in the community. After the interview, Margaret felt a surprising sense of pride. She'd articulated something important about her experience at the shelter, something that went beyond simple do-good volunteering to touch on deeper questions about purpose, community, and the ways people find meaning in unexpected places. As the day wound down, Margaret realized she'd spent nearly 8 hours at the shelter without feeling tired or bored. The work had energized rather than drained her, filled a space in her life she hadn't even realized was empty. When Patricia thanked her for her help and confirmed their Tuesday evening plan, Margaret felt like she was beginning a new chapter. Rather than ending a volunteer day, driving home, she thought about calling Linda to tell her about the past 2 days, but decided to wait. The experience still felt too new, too precious to share widely. She wanted to let it settle, to understand what it meant before trying to explain it to others. At home, she made herself a simple dinner from the remaining leftovers, a plate that would have seemed sadly solitary just 2 days before, but now felt like a peaceful conclusion to a day well spent. As she ate, she found herself planning future meals she could prepare for the shelter, thinking about the people she'd met and wondering about their stories. Her phone rang as she was finishing dinner. David's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret answered with genuine warmth. Hi, honey, how was your day? Good, really good. We went hiking with Sarah's family this morning. The weather here is incredible. But Mom, I keep thinking about what you told me yesterday about volunteering at the shelter. I looked it up online and read about the work they do. It sounds amazing. Margaret could hear something in David's voice that she couldn't quite identify. Certainly, but also something that might have been wistfulness or even regret. It really was incredible. David, I went back today and helped with their regular meal service. The people there are so genuine, so grateful, and the other volunteers are wonderful too. I feel like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mom, can I ask you something? Were you okay being alone on Christmas? I mean, really? Okay? Because Sarah and I were talking and we realized we just assumed you'd be fine, but we never actually asked what you wanted to do. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the things they hadn't said when David had called to tell her about Phoenix. Margaret felt a moment of choice. She could reassure him completely, protect him from any guilt or worry, or she could tell him something closer to the truth. It was hard at first, she said carefully. The house felt very quiet, and I missed our traditions. But David, what I discovered is that I'm more adaptable than I thought I was. The shelter gave me a way to honor Christmas that felt authentic and meaningful, even though it was completely different from what I'd planned. I'm so proud of you, Mom, but I also feel terrible that we left you alone. I should have thought more about what Christmas would be like for you. Oh, honey. Margaret's voice was soft with love. You made the right choice. Sarah's grandmother needed you, and that's exactly where you should have been. And honestly, if you'd stayed home out of obligation, we both would have felt terrible about it. This way, everyone got what they needed, even if it looked different than we expected. But still, David, Listen to me. I'm 53 years old. I raised you to be thoughtful and caring, and part of that means making decisions based on what's right, not what's easy or expected. You chose to be where you were most needed, and I found a way to be where I was most useful. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's something to be proud of. She could hear the smile in his voice when he responded. When did you get so wise? Probably around the time I started serving mashed potatoes to strangers. Margaret laughed. But seriously, David, this experience has taught me something important about myself. I've spent so many years defining myself primarily as your mother, which I loved. Don't get me wrong, but I forgot that I'm also just Margaret, with my own interests and capabilities and ways of contributing to the world. Sarah's been saying something similar about her own mom, actually. About how hard it must be when your kids grow up and you have to figure out who you are when you're not actively parenting. Margaret was surprised by this insight. Sarah said that, yeah, she's been thinking a lot about family dynamics since we got married. She really wants to have a good relationship with you, Mom. She was actually the one who suggested we should have asked you to come to Phoenix with us. This revelation caught Margaret completely off guard. Really? Really? We talked about it after we got here, but by then it seemed too late to bring it up. Sarah felt terrible about it, especially when we realized you were spending Christmas alone. Margaret felt a wave of emotion, gratitude toward Sarah for her thoughtfulness, regret that they'd all been too polite or too careful to have this conversation when it mattered, and a strange kind of relief that her son and daughter-in-law had been thinking about her even when they'd made different choices. I appreciate that, David, I really do. But I'm glad things worked out the way they did. If I'd gone to Phoenix, I never would have discovered the shelter, never would have met Harold, and Patricia and all the other people who made my Christmas so meaningful. You really loved it, didn't you? I really did. And I'm going to keep doing it, not just during holidays but regularly. I feel like I've found a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. They talked for another 20 minutes, sharing details about their respective days, making plans for David and Sarah to visit in February, discussing the possibility of all three of them volunteering together at some point. By the time they hung up, Margaret felt like something had shifted in her relationship with her son, not dramatically, but subtly, in a way that felt healthy and mature. David had seen her not just as his mother who needed taking care of or worrying about, but as an independent woman capable of creating her own meaningful experiences, and she had been able to share her joy about the shelter without making him feel guilty about his absence, presenting it as a positive discovery rather than a consolation prize. As Margaret got ready for bed that night, she reflected on how much her understanding of Christmas had evolved in just 2 days. She'd started the week thinking that Christmas was about specific traditions, the tree, the presents, the family gathering around her dining room table. She'd believed that without those elements the holiday would be meaningless, just another day to endure. But what she'd discovered at the shelter was that Christmas was really about something much more fundamental: the impulse to care for others, to create warmth and nourishment, to build connections that transcend the ordinary boundaries of daily life. The location might be different, the recipients might be strangers, but the essential spirit of the holiday, generosity, love, community, could be expressed in countless ways. Margaret fell asleep that night with a sense of anticipation about the future that she hadn't felt in months. Tuesday's dinner service at the shelter was just 4 days away. She was already planning what she might cook, already looking forward to seeing Harold and the other regulars, already imagining the conversations she might have with new guests who needed a warm meal and a friendly face. But, more than that, she was beginning to envision a life that looked different from the one she'd been living for the past several months, a life with more purpose, more connection to her community, more ways to express the nurturing instincts that had always been such a central part of who she was. The empty house no longer felt like a symbol of abandonment. It felt like a launching pad for new adventures, a peaceful retreat where she could plan and prepare for the work that was beginning to feel less like volunteering and more like calling. 3 weeks later, Margaret was in her element. The Tuesday evening dinner service at the Denver Rescue Mission had become the highlight of her week, something she looked forward to with the same anticipation she'd once reserved for David's visits home from college. But it wasn't just Tuesdays anymore. She'd gradually increased her involvement, helping with food prep on Mondays, occasionally filling in for other volunteers, and even starting a small program to teach basic cooking skills to shelter guests who were transitioning to more permanent housing. The work had given her life, a structure and purpose that felt both familiar and entirely new. She woke up each morning with a sense of anticipation, whether she was planning menus, shopping for ingredients, or simply looking forward to the conversations she'd have with the regular guests who had become something like friends. Harold had taken to calling her the General because of the way she'd organized the kitchen's efficiency systems. Maria had started bringing her granddaughter to the shelter on Tuesdays, and the little girl had begun running to Margaret for hugs as soon as they arrived. Tommy, the teenager who'd missed his grandmother's pecan pie, had become her unofficial sous chef, showing up early to help with prep work and staying late to help with cleanup. The relationships she'd built felt genuine and mutual. She wasn't just providing service. She was receiving community, purpose, and a kind of daily education about resilience, gratitude, and the countless ways people could find dignity and joy even in difficult circumstances. Margaret had also been surprised by how much she'd learned about herself through this work. She'd discovered that she was naturally good at organization and logistics, skills that had been mostly invisible when she'd used them to manage David's childhood, but were highly valued in the shelter environment. She'd found that she enjoyed teaching not just cooking techniques, but also the kind of practical life skills that could help someone stretch a food budget or make a nutritious meal from limited ingredients. Most importantly, she'd realized that her capacity for nurturing wasn't diminished by David's absence from her daily life. It had simply been waiting for new outlets, new people to care for, new ways to express the fundamental generosity that had always been. At the core of her personality on this particular Tuesday evening in mid-January, Margaret was preparing for what had become a special monthly tradition, a more elaborate dinner that she funded and organized herself, featuring dishes from her own kitchen alongside the shelter's regular offerings. It was her way of bringing some of the warmth and abundance of her family traditions into this new family she'd found. She'd arrived early to prepare her grandmother's lasagna recipe, a complex, labor-intensive dish that served 24 people and took most of the afternoon to assemble properly. As she worked, layering noodles and sauce and cheese with the meditative precision of someone who'd done this countless times, she reflected on how much her relationship with cooking had evolved. For years, her elaborate meal preparation had been driven by love for David, but also by a kind of anxiety about being enough, providing enough, proving her worth through the complexity and perfection of what she could create. Now, cooking for the shelter guests felt different, simpler somehow, despite the larger quantities. She cooked from abundance rather than anxiety. From joy rather than obligation. Patricia wandered into the kitchen around 4 p.m., drawn by the incredible aromas filling the space. "Margaret, that smells absolutely divine. What's your secret ingredient?" "Time," Margaret said simply. "And the fact that I know it's going to make people happy, that changes everything about the cooking process." As they talked, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. David's name appeared on the screen, but instead of his usual cheerful update, this message was longer and more serious in tone. "Mom, I need to tell you something. Sarah's grandmother passed away yesterday. The funeral is Thursday in Phoenix. I know this is short notice, but would you consider flying out here? Sarah really wants you there, and honestly, I need you too. I know you have your shelter work, but this is important." Margaret stared at the message, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for Sarah's loss, certainly, and immediate empathy for what David and his wife must be going through. But also something more complicated, a kind of awareness that this request was coming not from David, the independent married man, but from David, the son who needed his mother during a difficult time. "Everything okay?" Patricia asked, noticing Margaret's expression. "My daughter-in-law's grandmother died. The funeral is Thursday, and David wants me to come to Phoenix. Margaret paused, trying to articulate what she was feeling. "It's not that I don't want to be there for them. Of course I do. But I also have commitments here now. People who are expecting me to be here." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "You know, one of the beautiful things about this work is that it teaches you that being needed in multiple places is actually a blessing, not a burden. The fact that David wants you there during a difficult time is wonderful, and the fact that you have meaningful work here that you don't want to abandon is equally wonderful. But how do I choose? Who says you have to choose? We can manage without you for a few days. We did it for years before you showed up, after all. And your son needs you right now in a way that's probably different from how he's needed you recently." Margaret looked around the kitchen, taking in the familiar sights and smells of her Tuesday routine. She'd built something here, created relationships and responsibilities that mattered to her. But Patricia was right. The work would continue without her, and David's need was immediate and finite. She texted back, "Of course I'll come. Send me the flight details and I'll be there." The response came immediately. "Thank you, Mom. I love you so much. Sarah will be so relieved." 2 hours later, Margaret was on a plane to Phoenix, having arranged coverage for her shelter responsibilities and packed a bag with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to be adaptable. As the plane lifted off from Denver, she found herself thinking about the unexpected ways life could circle back on itself, how events could force you to integrate different parts of yourself rather than choosing between them. David met her at the Phoenix airport, and Margaret was struck by how much older he looked than he had just 3 weeks earlier. Grief had a way of aging people quickly, adding weight to their shoulders and shadows around their eyes. But when he saw her coming down the concourse, his face transformed with relief and gratitude. "Mom, thank you for coming. I know this was last minute, and I know you had things planned in Denver." "Oh, honey," Margaret said, pulling him into a hug that felt different from their usual greetings. Longer, tighter, more necessary. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be when you need me." Sarah was waiting in the car, and Margaret was surprised by how genuinely happy she felt to see her daughter-in-law. Over the past month, as she'd built her new life in Denver, Margaret had found herself thinking about Sarah more charitably, appreciating her thoughtfulness and the obvious love she had for David. "Margaret, I'm so sorry to drag you out here," Sarah said, turning around from the front seat to squeeze Margaret's hand. "But I'm so grateful you came. Grandma Rose she was really special. I think you would have liked her." "I'm sure I would have," Margaret replied, and meant it. "Tell me about her." As they drove through Phoenix's desert landscape, Sarah shared stories about her grandmother, her strength as a young widow raising 4 children alone, her legendary Sunday dinners that could feed 30 people, her habit of sending care packages to family members across the country, her insistence on handwritten thank you notes and homemade birthday cakes. Listening to Sarah's stories, Margaret felt a deep recognition. Rose sounded like someone who'd understood the same truths about nurturing and family that Margaret was just beginning to rediscover through her work at the shelter. That love expressed through care and feeding could create bonds that transcended biology. That there were many ways to be family to the people who needed it. The funeral was held at a small Catholic church in a neighborhood where Rose had lived for 40 years. Margaret was struck by how many people attended, not just family, but neighbors, former coworkers, people from Rose's church, families she'd helped over the decades. It was the kind of funeral that testified to a life lived in service to others, a life that had created ripples of impact that extended far beyond immediate family. During the service, Margaret found herself thinking about her own mother, who had died 5 years earlier after a long battle with Alzheimer's. Margaret's mother had been a good woman, but a more private one. Someone who'd focused her nurturing energy primarily on her own family. Sitting in this church, surrounded by evidence of Rose's broader impact on her community, Margaret felt a new understanding of the path she'd begun walking at the shelter. After the burial, the family gathered at Rose's house for a meal that had been organized by her neighbors and church friends. Margaret offered to help in the kitchen and found herself working alongside women who shared story after story about Rose's generosity, the meals she'd brought to new mothers, the way she'd organized food drives for struggling families, her habit of accidentally making too much dinner and showing up at the doors of elderly neighbors with the surplus. "She always said that food was love made visible," said Alina, one of Rose's closest friends. "She believed that you could change someone's whole day by showing up with a casserole and a kind word." Margaret felt a deep chill of recognition. This was exactly what she'd been learning at the shelter, that the act of feeding people was about much more than nutrition, that it was about dignity, connection, and the fundamental human need to feel valued and cared for. That evening back at David and Sarah's apartment, Margaret found herself in a long conversation with her son and daughter-in-law about family, tradition, and the ways people create meaning in their lives. Sarah talked about how much she'd learned from her grandmother about the importance of community service, how Rose had volunteered at a soup kitchen for over 20 years before her health declined. "She always said that the best way to honor your blessings was to share them," Sarah said. "Mom, what you're doing at the shelter, Rose, would have loved that. She would have understood exactly why you found it so meaningful." David nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot, actually. About what you said on the phone about finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing. I think maybe I need to find something like that too." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I love my job, and I love Sarah, and I'm grateful for the life we're building together. But watching you talk about the shelter, seeing how energized and purposeful you are when you describe that work, I realize I don't have anything in my life that gives me that kind of satisfaction. Everything I do is for me, my career, my hobbies, even my relationships are really about my own happiness and fulfillment." Sarah reached over and took his hand. "We've been talking about this actually, about finding ways to give back, to be useful to our community the way both our grandmothers were." Margaret felt a flutter of pride and something deeper, a sense that the lessons she'd learned from her unexpected Christmas were somehow being passed on, creating their own ripples of impact. "You know," she said carefully, "the shelter always needs volunteers, and there are plenty of other ways to serve. The important thing is finding something that feels authentic to who you are, not just doing good because you think you should." They talked late into the night, sharing stories about Rose, about Margaret's work at the shelter, about the ways people could create family and community beyond the traditional boundaries. Margaret found herself describing Harold and Maria and Tommy, realizing as she talked how much these relationships had come to mean to her, how naturally she'd begun to think of them as part of her extended family. "Mom," David said as they were finally getting ready for bed, "I owe you an apology." "For what? For not understanding what Christmas meant to you this year? For assuming you'd be fine alone without really asking what you wanted or needed? For not recognizing that you were dealing with your own transition, your own need to figure out who you are now that I'm not living at home anymore?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Oh, David, you don't owe me any apology. You made the right choice, and it led me to make choices that changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. But I should have seen that you were struggling with the changes too. I was so focused on building my new life with Sarah that I didn't think about how those changes were affecting you. Honey, that's exactly what you should have been doing. And the fact that I had to figure out my own path, my own purpose, that's what I should have been doing too. We both did what we needed to do, even if it was hard at the time." Sarah, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Margaret, I hope you know that you're not losing David by him getting married. You're gaining us as a family. And after seeing what you've built at the shelter, after hearing about the work you're doing, I want to be part of that somehow. I want to learn from you." Margaret looked at these two young people, her son and his wife, and felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of an ending, but the completion of a circle that was now large enough to include new people, new purposes, new ways of expressing love and care. "There's room for everyone," she said simply. "At the shelter, in this family, in the work of taking care of each other, there's always room for everyone." Flying back to Denver 2 days later, Margaret felt like she was returning not just to a city, but to a calling. The shelter work was waiting for her, but so was something else, a new understanding of how the different parts of her life could support and enrich each other rather than competing for her attention. David and Sarah had made plans to visit Denver in March, specifically to volunteer at the shelter with her. They were also investigating volunteer opportunities in Phoenix, inspired by Rose's example and by Margaret's stories about the satisfaction of service. As the plane descended through the Colorado mountains, Margaret could see the city spread out below, including the downtown area where the shelter was located, where Harold and Maria and Tommy and all the others were going about their daily lives, where Patricia was probably already planning next week's menu. She'd left Denver as someone fleeing loneliness and returned as someone moving toward community. The difference wasn't just in her circumstances, it was in her understanding of what family meant, what purpose looked like, what it meant to be needed and useful in the world. Margaret's phone buzzed as the plane touched down. A text from Patricia. "Welcome back. Harold's been asking when the general returns. Tuesday dinner won't be the same without you." Another text, this one from David. "Safe travels, Mom. Thank you for being exactly who we needed this week. Love you." And finally, one from Sarah. "Thank you for showing us what it looks like to build a meaningful life. Can't wait to learn from you in March." Margaret smiled as she gathered her things, feeling rich with connection and purpose in ways that had nothing to do with being alone or not alone. Everything to do with being useful, valued, and genuinely needed by multiple communities that had become, in their own ways, family. The empty house she'd left behind after Christmas morning had been transformed into something else entirely, not by the addition of people, but by the expansion of her own understanding of what home and family could be. She was returning to a life that looked nothing like the one she'd planned, but felt more authentically hers than anything she'd experienced in years. As she walked through the airport, Margaret was already planning Tuesday's menu, already imagining the stories she'd share with Harold about the funeral, already anticipating the moment when she'd walk back into the shelter kitchen and Patricia would hand her an apron and say, "Welcome home," because that's exactly what it was, home in all the ways that mattered most,